The smell on the field at Cunaxa is not what later writers remember. It is the smell of horse sweat already going cold in the September dusk, of the slow leak of intestines from a torn cuirass, and underneath it, the sharp grass and honey scent of the Babylonian wormwood crushed flat by 10,000 pairs of feet. The Greeks are standing in their phalanx in the middle of the Mesopotamian plain, 600 miles from the nearest Greek city, and they have just won the battle. They do not yet know they have lost the war. It is the late afternoon of a day in early September of the year 401 BC. Their employer, the Persian prince Cyrus the Younger, who paid them in good silver to march east on what he called a campaign against rebellious Pisidians, and who 1 week ago finally admitted he was actually marching on his brother the great king. Their employer is dead. He took a javelin in the temple, charging the royal bodyguard. The Greeks, on their wing of the line, broke the troops opposite them with a single ordered advance and pursued for 2 miles. They turned around to find Cyrus dead, the rest of his army melted into the desert, and themselves standing alone on a battlefield owned by Artaxerxes II, great king of Persia, king of kings. 10,003. That is the number Xenophon will give decades later, writing in retirement on his estate at Scyllus in the Peloponnese. 10,000 heavy infantry and 300 bowmen. Diodorus, working from sources independent of Xenophon, gives roughly the same figure. The manuscripts disagree on the exact count of light troops, but on the heavy infantry they hold. 10,000 Greek hoplites, 1,500 miles inside the Persian Empire, with no employer, no map, no supply line, and an Achaemenid army of unknown size moving up behind them. This is the story of how one of them, a 31-year-old Athenian gentleman who had come along almost as a tourist, who had never commanded a unit larger than a household, who had brought along his books, walked them out, and of how, 4 centuries later, a Roman tribune at his evening reading would close this same book and design the camp his legions slept in tonight. Xenophon opens the Anabasis with one of the great cold sentences in ancient prose. Darius and Parysatis had 2 sons, the elder Artaxerxes, the younger Cyrus. He does not say we, not for 2 books. For the first 2 books, he writes about himself in the 3rd person, as if he were a minor character. A man named Xenophon, an Athenian, came along not as a soldier or a captain or a market warden, but because Proxenos, his guest friend, had sent for him. I read that passage 3 times before I caught what he is doing. He is hiding his own promotion behind a grammar trick. He wants you to think the hollow square invented itself. It did not invent itself. Somebody had to make the call. Before we get there, you need to see how the 10,000 ended up on that field. In the early winter of 402, in his palace at Sardis, the satrap Cyrus the Younger sent letters to 4 men. The first was Proxenos of Boeotia, a former student of the sophist Gorgias, who was running a small mercenary company in central Greece. The second was Clearchus of Sparta, an exile and the most feared mercenary commander of the age. The third was Menon of Thessaly, who would later die slowly under Persian torture. The fourth was Sophinetos of Stymphalos, an older officer with experience in Cyprus. Each letter said the same thing, more or less. The satrap is preparing a campaign against the Pisidian highlanders, who have been raiding the satrapy. Come with as many troops as you can recruit. Bring them to the muster point at Sardis by the spring. The pay is gold.
It was, of course,
not about Pisidians. Cyrus's brother Artaxerxes had taken the throne 2 years earlier, after their father Darius II died. Cyrus had been at the deathbed. Cyrus had, by his own account and his mother's, been promised the succession. Cyrus had then been arrested by Artaxerxes inside the palace and only saved by his mother's intercession. Cyrus had gone back to his satrapy in Anatolia and started raising an army. Quietly. In pieces. Greeks for the heavy infantry, because the Greek hoplite phalanx was, in the year 401, the best heavy infantry in the world. And Cyrus knew it, because his Persian gold had paid for the Spartan fleet that broke the Athenian one at Aegospotami 3 years earlier. Proxenos wrote to his old guest friend Xenophon in Athens and said, "There is something interesting being prepared in Sardis. The pay is unusually good. Cyrus is a man worth knowing. Come." Xenophon, who had been a young cavalry officer under the 30 tyrants and was finding civilian Athens uncomfortable for a man with his political history, took the letter to Socrates. Socrates told him to go to Delphi first and ask the god whether to take the offer. Xenophon, in a passage he records with the dry honesty that is the best thing in his book, went to Delphi and asked the god instead which gods he should sacrifice to in order to make the journey successful. The question already assumed the answer. Socrates, when Xenophon returned, told him gently that he had cheated the oracle and would have to live with it. He went anyway. He went, by his own admission, not as a soldier and not even as a passenger of any particular rank. He went as a guest. A man with a horse and a slave and his books, going east because his friend had asked him to. By the early spring of 401, 13,000 Greek mercenaries had assembled around Sardis. Cyrus marched them east, through Lydia, through Phrygia, through Cappadocia, telling them all the way that the target was Pisidia, then that it was the satrap Abracomus, then that it was a few rebellious tribes in northern Syria. They crossed the Euphrates at Thapsacus in late summer. The river was running unusually low. Cyrus's Persian flatterers told him this was a sign. The river was prostrating itself before the future king. By that point, even the Greeks could read the sign. They were not marching against Pisidians. They were 2 months' march from the heart of the empire and getting closer. There was a brief mutiny when the Greeks figured out what they were doing. Clearchus, the Spartan, handled it. He walked out in front of the assembled men and wept. The chronicle says he wept openly, not as a trick. And reading the passage now, you cannot tell with any honesty how much of it was grief and how much was a senior officer's instinct for theatre. He said, "I will not abandon you. I will not abandon him either. Whatever you decide, I march with you, because a man who has lost the trust of his employer in Persia and his own city in Sparta has nothing left but the men he commands." The mercenaries demanded a pay rise. Cyrus, when Clearchus came back to camp to bargain, agreed. He gave them half again. They marched on. In late summer or early September, Xenophon gives a precise day that modern editors have largely abandoned as unreliable, and Diodorus and Plutarch each give a slightly different reckoning. The army of Cyrus crossed the open plain of Cunaxa, perhaps 40 Roman miles north of Babylon by the lower of the modern estimates. The army of Artaxerxes was already there, drawn up in a line of unknown length. Xenophon's count of the royal army is 1,200,000. This is, I want to say plainly, a number nobody believes. Ctesias, the Greek doctor at the Persian court, who was actually present and treated the king's wound, gives 400,000. Modern scholarship splits between 50 and 100,000. The lower estimate is probably closer to the truth. What is certain is that the army opposite the Greeks stretched out of sight in both directions, and that they were heavily outnumbered even at the lowest reasonable count. Cyrus rode along the Greek line, shouting that they could see the king's bodyguard, the men in the gilded scale armor at the center. That was where Artaxerxes himself sat under the royal parasol. He said, in Greek, that Xenophon claims to have heard himself, "Brother of my brother, I am better than he is, and I will prove it on him today." He kicked his horse and rode at the center. The Greeks, on the right wing, advanced. What happened on the Greek wing was so easy it embarrassed even the Greeks. The Persian infantry opposite, palace troops, household cavalry, broke and ran the moment the phalanx came into spear range. The Greeks pursued for 2 miles before the senior officers managed to halt them and turn them around. By the time they got back to the original ground, the battle in the center was over. Cyrus had reached his brother. Cyrus had wounded his brother. Ctesias, who treated the wound, says it bled badly, and the prince almost lost his throne in that hour. And then, a Persian named Mithridates had thrown a dart that caught Cyrus near the temple. Cyrus fell from his horse, and the bodyguard cut him to pieces where he lay. Artaxerxes, by Plutarch's account, had his brother's right hand and his head severed and brought back to the royal command tent. The chronicler names a eunuch called Massabates as the man who actually did the cutting. The Greeks, on the field at sunset, knew nothing of this. They knew only that their wing had won. Their employer was somewhere on the field, and the rest of the army of Cyrus had disappeared. The mercenaries that Cyrus had recruited from Asia, light infantry, Paphlagonian horse, Lycian peltasts, were already streaming away to the west, taking the chance to vanish back to their villages before the great king's collectors found them. By midnight, the Greeks knew their employer was dead. By dawn, they knew they were alone. They were, to be precise about it, 690 miles in a straight line from the Greek coast. In actual marching, allowing for rivers and ranges, closer to 1,500. They had perhaps 10 days of grain in the wagons. They had no Persian guides who could be trusted. They had a Spartan general who had spent the night drinking in his tent. I have read this passage in Xenophon more times than I can count, and what I keep coming back to is how he tells you all this with no superlatives at all. He does not say it was hopeless. He does not say they were brave. He says, "There was a council of the captains, and the captains agreed that something must be done, and they did not know what to do." That sentence, written half a lifetime after the fact by a man who had every reason to dramatize, is the most honest sentence in Greek military prose. He knew. He had been there. He had heard the captains argue. He had also, though he is not yet ready to say so in the third person, been one of them. If the period, the chronicles, the campaigns, the small decisions that built and broke armies interests you, this is the work the channel does. There is more of it waiting. Back to Cunaxa, where the captains are deciding nothing. The first thing they decided was to march. Not east, deeper into the empire, not west, the way they had come, because the way they had come was now closed by the royal army. They decided to march north, up the Tigris, on a route nobody in the column had ever traveled. They sent envoys to the king. The king's reply, brought back by an officer named Phalanos, who had taken Persian service, was simple. Surrender your weapons. Throw yourselves on the king's mercy. Perhaps he will be merciful." Clearchus, the Spartan, gave the answer that became, for the next generation of Greek soldiers, a piece of common property. He said, "In the field, victors do not surrender their weapons. If the king wants them, let him come and take them." The envoy went back to the royal camp. The Greeks struck their tents and started north. To understand what happened in the 7 months that followed, through the river crossings, through the burned Persian countryside, through the murder of the generals at Tissaphernes' tent, through the Carduchian passes, where a third of the column was lost, through the Armenian snow, you have to understand what kind of army this actually was, and what kind of man was about to elect himself one of its commanders. A Greek hoplite of the year 401 carried, on his own back, more than a man should carry. The bronze helmet of the Corinthian type, hinged at the cheeks, weighed about 5 pounds. The bronze-faced shield, 3 feet across, weighed perhaps 15. The thrusting spear, 8 feet of cornel wood with an iron leaf-shaped head and a butt spike. Xenophon calls the butt spike the saurator, the lizard killer, added another 4. Then the linen corselet, glued in layers, with bronze scales sewn into the chest plates. Then the bronze greaves. Then the short curved sword, for when the spear broke, the kopis, on a belt at the right hip. Then a leather satchel of barley meal and dry cheese for 10 days. Then a folded woolen cloak that was also a blanket. And then, this is the part the schoolbooks leave out, a sharpened wooden stake, 5 feet long, with the bark stripped off, slung across his shoulder. The stake was for the camp. Every night, the moment the column halted, the men set the stakes into a trench around the wagons, point outward, and slept inside the line. Without the stakes, you could lose a column to a pre-dawn raid by horsemen who, in this country, could be on you in the time it took to lace a boot. The stake is the part nobody draws on the museum diagrams of the hoplite. It is also the part Polybius noticed 4 generations later when he was studying Xenophon for the Romans. A column of 10,000 such men is a slow thing. On a good road, on level ground, in friendly territory, with the baggage train moving cleanly, the Greeks could make about 15 Roman miles a day. On a bad road, in country that had been burned ahead of them by retreating Persian cavalry, with 2 rivers to ford and a sick man on every 5th pack mule, they made between 5 and 8. 1,500 miles to the Black Sea at 6 miles a day comes out to 250 days. They did it in less. They did it through a country that had been deliberately emptied of grain in front of them, in winter, with a Persian army shadowing them at the distance of a half-day's march and never quite committing to a fight. The man shadowing them was Tissaphernes. He had been satrap of Lydia and Caria for almost 20 years. He was the most experienced negotiator the Achaemenid court had. He had played both sides during the long war between Sparta and Athens, switching the Persian gold from one camp to the other at exactly the right moments. A game Thucydides describes at length and with open distaste. He had, at Cunaxa, commanded the wing opposite the Greeks, the wing the Greeks broke without losing a man. He had ridden back to the king and told him, by Plutarch's account, that the Greeks were not the problem. The problem was that they did not yet understand they had lost. He had been given the assignment of escorting them out of the empire by what was openly called a path of mutual friendship, and, by everybody who heard the phrase used, a path of mutual lies. For the first month it almost worked. The Greeks marched. Tissaphernes' column rode a half-day behind, and at every halt a Persian envoy came forward with gifts: wheat, cattle, jars of wine, a sealed letter of safe conduct. Clearchus, the Spartan, took the gifts and gave them out among the men. Tissaphernes, riding up alone in the evenings to share a cup with the senior Greek officers, was charming. He had been educated by Greek tutors. He spoke the language. He told stories from the Persian court. He never quite said when the column would be allowed to turn west toward the coast. Whenever the question came up, he changed it. He was very good at changing it. Clearchus went to him one evening at the beginning of the 3rd month and asked, plainly, whether there was a plot. Tissaphernes was offended. He swore by his right hand, by his father's tomb, by the king. He invited Clearchus to come the next day to his tent. Bring your senior officers, share a meal. We will draw up the formal march route on a single document. We will speak openly. The matter will be settled. Clearchus went back to the Greek camp and told the captains. Proxinos, the Boeotian, was uneasy. Menon of Thessaly, who had been undercutting Clearchus for weeks in private conversations with Tissaphernes, said the meeting was overdue. Sophinetos, the older man, said quietly that he would not go himself, and he was the only one whose instincts proved correct. On the appointed morning, 5 generals and 20 captains rode the half-mile across the no-man's land between the 2 camps. Tissaphernes met them at the door of his tent. He was, by Xenophon's careful description, dressed in a long median coat, embroidered with gold thread, and he embraced Clearchus like a brother. The Greeks left their swords with their grooms at the rope line, as was the rule for a satrap's tent. They went inside. The flap closed. What happened next was over in less time than it took to roast a kid. Persian guards came in from the back of the tent. The 5 generals were seized and bound. The 20 captains in the antechamber were cut down where they stood. One Greek officer, a man named Nikarchos of Arcadia, took a spear wound through the abdomen, broke loose, and ran the half-mile back to the Greek camp, holding his entrails inside his tunic. He reached the picket line, said the word Prodosia, treachery, and died in the dust at the feet of the man who would have to take command. Xenophon does not say which of the captains heard Nikarchos die. He writes again, in his careful 3rd person, that the news ran through the camp like water through a roof. Within an hour, the Greek camp was in something close to panic. The generals were gone. Half the senior captains were gone. The Persian column at the half-day's distance was already moving up in the dust on the eastern horizon. I have read this passage in 3 different translations and read it twice more in the Greek, and I keep being struck by the same thing. Xenophon never tells us he was personally afraid. He tells us about the dream. That night he writes, in the 3rd person, that an Athenian named Xenophon had a dream. He saw a thunderbolt strike his father's house, and the house was full of fire, but the fire did not consume it. He woke up. He did not know whether the dream was good or bad. He thought about it for an hour in the dark. He decided it was good, because the fire did not consume. He decided that the thunderbolt meant Zeus was sending him something, and that the something was not over yet. He got up, dressed, walked through the camp, picking up the captains of his friend Proxinos's company. Proxinos was now dead in Tissaphernes' tent. His men were leaderless, and called them together in the dark. He gave a speech. It is one of the longest speeches in the Anabasis. It runs, in the manuscripts, to about 3 lobe pages, and modern scholars are split on how much of it is the speech as delivered, and how much is the speech as Xenophon wished, decades later in Skylus, that he had delivered. J.K. Anderson argues that the tactical specifics, the proposal to elect new generals immediately, the proposal to form the column into a hollow square with the baggage in the center, the proposal to march that night before the Persians could realize the camp was leaderless, are too operationally precise to be retrofitted. Robin Lane Fox argues that some of the rhetorical flourishes were probably polished decades later. I lean toward Anderson, and I lean that way because the operational proposals all worked, and they worked the next morning before there could have been time for committee revision. By dawn, the captains of Proxenos's company had voted Xenophon into command of their 1,500 men. By midday, 5 other companies had done the same with their own surviving second-tier officers. By the evening of the second day after the murder, the army had 5 new generals, 3 of them men nobody outside their own companies had heard of a week earlier. Xenophon, who had come along with his books and his slave and his horse, was one of them. He was 31 years old. He had never commanded anything bigger than a household. The hollow square he proposed that first morning is the part of the Anabasis that became Roman doctrine. The idea was that the column on the march would not have a front, a flank, and a rear in the traditional sense. Instead, 4 blocks of heavy infantry would form a rectangle around the baggage and the wounded and the surgeons and the camp followers. The vanguard block faced front. The rearguard block faced rear. The 2 long sides faced outward. When the column hit a narrow pass and had to contract, the side blocks closed in on the baggage, and the formation became a tighter rectangle. When the column entered open ground, the side blocks could expand outward into a screen. When the rear was attacked, the rearguard turned about face on the spot and engaged, while the rest of the column kept moving. There was no flank to turn. There was no tail to cut off. The wounded did not get left behind. The grain did not get captured. The formation was the camp on the move. Polybius, 2.5 centuries later, will describe the marching column of a Roman consular army in hostile country in terms that read as if he had Xenophon open beside him. The Getius, 4 centuries after that, will tell the late Roman recruit that the camp at the end of the day's march is the most important thing he learns, because the camp is the army. Both men were paraphrasing a 31-year-old Athenian who had reasoned it out in the dark of a Mesopotamian camp the night his friend Proxenos was murdered. The shape of the Roman castra, the shape the legions still slept inside 4 centuries later in Britain, in Germania, in Mauritania, that shape was first drawn by a man who had never built a camp before, and who, by his own account, was not even sure if the dream of the lightning had been good or bad. The hollow square moved north for 10 days through country Tissaphernes had burned in front of them. Then it moved up the Tigris for another fortnight, with Tissaphernes's column always at a half-day's distance, never engaging, waiting for the Greeks to break. They did not break. They had no city to retreat to and no employer to disappoint. They had instead an Athenian who had started writing it down. And then the road they were on ran out. The Tigris bent east into the foothills of the Carduchian mountains, which were marked on no Greek map, and which, the Persian guide said with what Xenophon notes as evident relief, the king had never been able to subdue. Beyond the Carduchians lay Armenia. Beyond Armenia, by rumor, lay a sea. The Greeks held a council. They knew by then that following the Tigris east took them further into the empire. They knew that turning west into the desert was a death sentence. The third option was the mountains, where for 7 days They would be inside a country whose people, the Persians warned them, killed travelers for sport, and whose passes the royal army itself avoided. They went into the mountains. The first arrow came out of nothing. It hit a Greek peltast in the throat on the second morning in the Carduchian foothills, while the column was strung out along a goat path 2 men wide, and the man was dead before he hit the rocks. The next arrow killed the man behind him. By the time the rearguard officers had the screen of light infantry back in position, the column had lost 7, and not one Carduchian had been seen. The Persians had warned the Greeks about these people. The Persians had also said, with what Xenophon notes as transparent satisfaction, that the king's own army had once lost 120,000 men in these passes and never come back for the bodies. Carduchia. The word in Xenophon's Greek does not mean anything to a modern reader. The people on Greek maps later became, by drift of language, the Kurds. The mountains were the southern Anti-Taurus, the country that runs between the upper Tigris and the lake the Greeks called Thospetis, and the Armenians called Van. There were no roads. There were goat tracks following ridge lines, with a 1,000-foot drop on one side and a wall of rock on the other. There were pass villages of stone houses with roofs flat enough to walk on. The villagers did not stay to greet the column. They took their grain into the heights and rolled boulders down onto the path behind them. They shot arrows that, by Xenophon's careful description, were more than 2 Greek cubits long and pierced shield and armor together. He says, with the precision of a man who has examined the arrows pulled from his own troops, that the bows themselves were nearly 3 cubits in length and were drawn with the foot. 7 days the Greeks were in those mountains. Xenophon, who marched with the rearguard now, the most dangerous position in the column, the one nobody else wanted, does not flinch from the count. Of the 10,000 who had left Cunaxa, perhaps 8,000 entered Carduchia. Of those, by his own count, 1,500 did not come out. Some were lost to arrows, some to rockfalls, some to the cold of nights at 6,000 feet, when the column slept without tents in the snow because the wagons had been abandoned at the foot of the first pass. Some, and this is the part Xenophon writes with the longest silence, were left along the trail by their friends because they could not be carried up another slope. There is a passage in Book 4 that I have read more times than any other passage in the Anabasis. It is short. It does not draw attention to itself. A Greek hoplite, on the second day in the Armenian highlands beyond Carduchia, sat down in the snow on the side of the path and said he would not get up. He had no fever. He had no wound. He was simply finished. The men who had been carrying his pack, friends from his own city, by Xenophon's description, argued with him for some time. He told them to leave him with his ration of bread and to keep going. They went. The column was already a mile ahead. A younger man, by Xenophon's careful description, not yet 20, was bringing up the rear of the rear guard. He saw the older man sitting in the snow. He stopped. He took off his own woolen cloak, the cloak that, in those temperatures, was the difference between sleeping and not waking up. He wrapped it around the older man. He pulled him to his feet. He carried half his weight up the next slope. By the evening, they had both reached the next camp. The older man lived. Xenophon, who was passing through the column at the right moment, saw it happen. He does not preach about it. He writes a few sentences about it and moves on. But it is the sentence that tells you what kind of army this had become, and why, in the next 30 days, the Persian king who had counted them dead would learn that they had reached the sea. An army where a 19-year-old will give away the cloak that is keeping him alive. That army is no longer 10,000 mercenaries. That army is something else. Xenophon has no Greek word for what it is. He simply describes what the boy did and lets the next sentence be about the road ahead. The road ahead was the Centrites River. The river was the border between Carduchia and Armenia, and the Carduchians had assembled on the far bank in numbers that the rearguard officers, looking through the autumn dusk, estimated at 3,000 to 4,000. The river was 400 feet wide, breast deep in the center, with a current that knocked over a horse if it went in sideways. The far bank was a sheer mud cliff, 6 feet high. The Greeks were trapped against a country they had just escaped, with a wider country waiting on the other side of a river they could not cross under fire. Xenophon that night had another dream. He writes about it in the third person and is careful to give the date and the camp. He dreamt that he was in chains and that the chains fell off by themselves before he had touched them. He woke up in the dark and walked through the camp until he found 2 Greek soldiers who had just come back from gathering firewood and who said, in passing, that they had found a ford 2 miles upstream where the water was only knee-deep and the far bank a gentle slope. Xenophon does not say it was a miracle. He simply notes the dream and notes the ford, and notes that the next morning the column crossed the river with no Greek lost. I have read this passage, and I cannot tell you with any honesty whether Xenophon believed the dream caused the ford, or whether he is letting his reader connect the two and draw his own conclusion. Lane Fox thinks the dreams are literary structure imposed in retirement. Anderson thinks they were genuine and noted in a campaign journal. I lean here toward Lane Fox. The dreams cluster too neatly at the structural turning points to be raw chronology. But the ford was real, and the crossing was real, and the column reached Armenia. Armenia, in late November of 401, was already deep in snow. The wind came down from the headwaters of the Euphrates and crossed the plateau without anything to break it. The Greeks marched, by Xenophon's count, 6 days through snow that came to the men's knees and then through snow that came to their waists. Men went snowblind. Men lost toes. Men lost feet. A practice spread through the column, rubbing animal fat onto the exposed skin and wrapping the feet in greased leather. And Xenophon notes the older Spartan veterans of his command as the ones who taught it. It saved many. It did not save all. Xenophon also tells, again in his careful third person, of the night he himself walked through the camp, checking the sentries, and found 2 men buried in snow up to the shoulders, sitting upright, frozen. He gives the detail that one of them was still holding his spear. By the 8th of December, they came down out of the high country into the headwaters of the Phasis River. The villages here had stone houses set into the hillside, with the doors opening into underground tunnels, and inside those tunnels the Greeks found grain, dried mutton, jars of barley beer that was drunk through reed straws because the husks floated on the surface. Xenophon, who was always interested in how other people lived, describes the beer in some detail. He says it was bitter when first tasted, and then, after a few cups, very pleasant. He also notes that the village elder, who was 80 years old and the only Greek speaker, told them they were now closer to the sea than to Babylon, and that if they kept north, they would reach the country of the Macrones, and beyond the Macrones lay the Greek-speaking city of Trapezus on the coast. Trapezus. The name, in Greek, means The table, the flat shelf the city sat on above the sea. It was a colony of Sinope, which was a colony of Miletus. It was, in the year 401, the easternmost Greek-speaking city in the world. To the Greeks of the 10,000, who had been hearing rumors of a sea for 2 months and had begun to wonder whether the rumors were the kind soldiers tell each other to keep marching, the name was a real thing for the first time. The old man drew them a map on the dirt floor of his house with a stick. He showed them the pass they would take through the country of the Chalybes, who made the best iron in the ancient world, and then the Scythinian highlands, and then a long descent through the country of the Macrones, and then a final ridge, and then the sea. For another month they marched, and there were more skirmishes with hill tribes who had never seen Greeks before, and there was a night battle in a pass where Xenophon's rearguard repulsed a Chalybian attack and counted 15 Greek dead by torchlight. There was also a sequence I have always loved, in which an entire Armenian village was bribed to feed the column for 3 days in exchange for the column's promise to leave the village standing. And Xenophon describes, with a moralist's quiet pleasure, that Clearchus's old soldiers, who would have burned the place once for sport, kept the promise. He notes that they kept it because the army had voted, in council, that it would be kept. Democracy, Xenophon says elsewhere in his own voice, has its uses in a long march. He was a conservative Athenian who had distrusted Athenian democracy all his life. By the end of the Anabasis, he had been forced to admit that an army that votes on its own discipline is harder to destroy than an army that does not. And then one morning in the early winter of the year 400 BC, the vanguard of the column came over a ridge and started shouting. The rearguard, 2 miles back down the column, heard the shouting and did not understand it.